His friend, Dominic, received 6 to 8 years as an accessory.
For 2 years, the family of Danielle Locklear has waged a fight for justice, and now that chapter is coming to an end.
I can't watch my baby get her high school diploma. I cannot watch her get married. That's the only one I can't even have any more children, JaMichael. And you took that away from me. You ripped out my soul.
Police say the 19-year-old confessed to strangling Locklear during an argument. They say he and a friend tied cinder blocks around her body and dumped her into the South River. Danielle's body was found a month later.
I know there's nothing I can do there, what I can say. It's going to bring her back. But I do want to apologize for the actions that I've made. I know sorry doesn't cut it, but I do want to say I'm truly sorry.
MWIII pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder and will spend a minimum of 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole.
Every day for the next 25 years, or however long you have, when you close your eyes, you will see Danielle taking her last breath.
And Sinead, that is the story of Ms. Locklear. The real truth we will never know. Was she pregnant? Was she claiming she was pregnant to try and get back with JaMichael? Did she believe she actually was pregnant? What really happened? Was there some other reason why he killed her? He pleaded guilty. So there's so much about this that we will not ever really know. What he killed her over is unthinkable, but it happened. JaMichael was as cool as a cucumber, except when he wasn't. Like this picture caught of him in the middle of the search for Danielle. One of Danielle's family members took this picture as she believed he was acting suspicious. I guess he believed he was killing for his dream, but in reality, he killed his dream. Thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot to me that you are here. Thanks, guys. Here, listen, next video will be up in a couple of days, so please give it a go when it's out. But if you know you just can't wait, please check out the That Chapter podcast, which has an episode out every single Monday. It's they're completely different stories to what I tell here on the channel. So please check it out if you're looking for something to listen to. But you know what? Until I see you, which will be real soon, please take care of each other and yourselves, because I love you. Mike out.
I wanted to talk about what is going on with Israel. It's kind of crazy. Obviously, like, the American reaction to students protesting against Israel has been insane. Somewhat expected, but still kind of insane. How aggro they are, how much they're flailing. Like, all you need to do is just go out there and be a voice, and people still lose their minds. They're like, this is unhinged. Like, we have to kill you. We have to arrest you. We have to do everything we can. Having said that, Israel is also being unimaginably unhinged simultaneously, just doing Israel. There has been a ceasefire negotiation process with a lot of back and forth for some time now. Israel is the party that has been ruining the ceasefire terms. I know that it takes two to tango, but for the most part, I would say that Hamas's conditions have been endlessly reasonable. Israel's reaction has been anything but. Now, of course, if you look at the American news coverage, the Western media's coverage on the issue, you would basically come up with an entirely different, perhaps the exact opposite of what is the truth. So basically, what I'm trying to say is the media is presenting what is actually happening, looking at what is actually happening and just presenting the exact opposite. The exact opposite. The thing is, like, the final stage of this ceasefire agreement is basically what Hamas has said, I would say, since like October 8th. We will give you all the hostages back. You just have to issue a permanent ceasefire, 1967 boundaries, come to the negotiation table with the 1967 boundaries, which would obviously be like the two-state solution. No more arms. We will lay down our arms. Basically a day one position, which Israel routinely said know to. And it turns out that there's more information about Benjamin Netanyahu almost personally ruining the bag. There's basically no condition that Israel wants. None whatsoever that Israel is willing to agree to. I think the latest that I read was in this round of conversations, basically they claimed that like the Hamas acceptance was coming from an Egyptian envoy, and Egypt is also Hamas. Well, they didn't say that, but they said that the Egyptian terms were like infinitely softer than what the Israel would be down for or something. And this is after Hamas agreed to the latest proposal presented by Israel on April 27th, and there is no change in its elements. An official matter with the talks, tells Reuters. Okay, this is like literally happening as we're talking. And the only thing that I've seen from Israel is that although it is their proposal, they no longer actually feel comfortable with it and are saying that maybe Egypt has softened that deal too much. Let's be real. The Israeli officials are saying the proposal Hamas accepted is different than the one initially presented to Israel. Yeah, it's a three-stage peace plan, three-stage ceasefire negotiation, as Time Without an Ovia also mentioned here. First stage is like the facilitation of the hostage swaps, right? Which would mean prisoner releases from the Israeli side as well, including some high-profile prisoners. Second stage would be hostage negotiation, and then the third stage would be a reconstruction, exchange of corpses, like people, the hostages that have died, including Palestinians that have died and their bodies as well. And the final stage being the 1967 boundaries, permanent ceasefire. The things that the Brandon government has advocated for, as a matter of fact. The things that Joe Brandon keeps saying, we've got two-state solution, Jack. The things that Benjamin Netanyahu has routinely been like, off. That's not happening to. As far as I understand, though, unfortunately, while Hamas has agreed to the latest terms and conditions of a ceasefire agreement, Israel very clearly is not interested in that at all. They don't give it. Hamas's latest ceasefire talks have ended. Israel vows military operation in the very near future. The latest information that just came out is that, like, Hamas has accepted conditions. Israel is like, sorry, we already set in motion the acts. We just have to kill children in Rafah. We have to do it because we're really horny for it. We geared up for it. We got dolled up. Sorry, we got dolled up and ready to go to the ball. You can't just take that away from me. No takebacks. The genocide will continue until morale improves. Exactly. The major reason as to why that's happening is because of their overarching goals, not being one that is genuinely interested in permanent security for Israelis at all, but one that is about killing as many Palestinians as physically possible in a short period of time, while also maintaining political cover from the Western world. Also, for the record, Volodymyr Zelensky, one of our Israeli chatters, just reported on this as well from their personal experience, but Israel also literally made Al Jazeera illegal. As of yesterday, officially, Al Jazeera is no longer accessible in the wonderful, beautiful, best democracy in the world, better democracy than the United States of America, Israel. The only democracy, not in the Middle East, the only democracy in the world. All right, Hamas accept terms of Gaza ceasefire deal as Israel readies the Rafah operation.
With that breaking news this hour, very important breaking news, because an official Hamas source has told the BBC that it does accept a proposal for a ceasefire deal in Gaza. Now, Israel has yet to comment on that. We'll bring you more details on it as soon as we get them. Meanwhile, Palestinian civilians have started leaving parts of eastern Rafah in Gaza after Israel told 100,000 people.
They dropped leaflets in Rafah already, doing Drizzy Drake, BBL. Israel was busy dropping leaflets in Rafah being like, get the out of here. We're about to kill you. We are the most moral force in the region. We are the most moral army, the most democratic genocidal state you'll ever see. Look at us. We're dropping pamphlets. We're dropping leaflets, dude. How wonderful. Yeah, we're roof knocking 1.4 million people that have been trapped at this point inside of Rafah, the area that is the southernmost tip of the Gaza Strip that is connected to Egypt, that Israel is basically kettled every single Palestinian into. Palestinian Authority officials oppose release of Marwan Barghouti is the least shocking thing that I've ever heard. Palestinian Authority, they can suck my Senior Palestinian Authority officials have requested from mediators that Fatah leader Marwan Barghouti be excluded from potential prisoner swap deal between Israel and Hamas, a source told the Middle East Eye. A source familiar with the negotiations told MWIII on Sunday that the request was made by Majid Faraj, the director of the Palestinian General Intelligence, and Hussein al-Sheikh, the general secretary of the Palestine Liberation Organization's executive committee. I wonder why they don't want Barghouti to be released. Well, there it is. It's because senior Palestinian Authority leaders believe Barghouti's release would threaten the leadership of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, the least popular figure in the eyes of the Palestinians. And Marwan Barghouti is the most popular figure in the eyes of the Palestinians, and that's precisely why the Palestinian Authority would not want Barghouti to be released from prison. According to the source, the United States, one of the 3 mediators involved in the indirect Gaza ceasefire negotiations, had reportedly agreed to remove Barghouti's name from any potential list Hamas is expected to present. It does no favors to Hamas to release Barghouti, as Barghouti is supposed to be a competing political entity, is not on Hamas's side at all in this conversation. And Barghouti is literally more popular than Hamas. Barghouti is more popular than Ismail Haniyeh. Barghouti is more popular than Abu Ubaida. He is a Fatah member who is directly contest with Hamas, and yet they still want leaders of other factions to be released because Hamas, as a political entity, cares more about resisting against the Israeli apartheid than it does about its own personal political motivations. Its own personal motivations in terms of like being the managing governing body of Gaza or the managing governing body of Palestinians in general. They do, however, want to be the governing body for all Palestinians instead of Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority is a part of the security apparatus, the Israeli security apparatus, rather. In terms of like having PFLP, DFLP be like political actors, they've collaborated. October 7 was a collaborative effort from all members of the Palestinian resistance across the board. They obviously also are literally trying to release prisoners that are directly their major political enemies in this circumstance. Ones with actual proximity to power if they are released from prison, if they are free. Do we know what percentage of Palestinians support the Hamas regime? I mean, those numbers change in general, but we do know the Palestinians are polled pretty frequently. Hamas is more popular in the West Bank than they are in Gaza. That much makes sense. To be fair, even though Barghouti is originally Fatah, he's been in favor of national unity leadership with Hamas and the other faction for a while. There were reports in Arab media that he was on the list on Saturday, so it'll be very sad if this is true. Barghouti is considered the Nelson Mandela of Palestinians, for the record. Marwan Barghouti is. For those of you who don't know, I've covered him before. He is seen as like a Nelson Mandela style figure. Don't know if you've seen this, but the IDF forces have already crossed the border. Initial report of IDF tanks crossing the fence in the south of the Gaza Strip. Also an infantry force. Well, never mind. Seems like Israel is already declining. It seems like Israel is already moving into Rafah and said you to the last desperate attempt from Hamas to come to the table and be treated as human beings. Israel is not going to do that. I think we should have gone into Rafah yesterday. There are no uninvolved civilians there. You have to go in and kill. You have to kill them before they kill us. That's Shimon Boker, the vice chairman of the World Likud, the international arm of Netanyahu's party. This is what he had to say 3 days ago on Channel 12's Ophira and Levinson talk show regarding the topic of a hostage deal in Rafah invasion.
אז תסביר לי רגע מה דעתך, כי לא הבנתי. אני חושב שצריך להיכנס אתמול כבר לרפיח, להיכנס
ואז מה יקרה?
ולהיכנס ולהרוג.
ואז הם יצאו מתחת לאדמה.
אין שם בלתי מעורבים, צריך להיכנס ולהרוג ולהרוג.
The final chapter of Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip. Amir Balbot adds, armored forces from the border area are firing massively at targets in the Rafah area, and that's it. In spite of the United States of America saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, over and over and over again, he's still doing it. The war cabinet is moving forward, and it seems like the last remaining area that has not been completely pancaked by the Israeli occupying force. I mean, it is in a dire situation.
By Hamas is the same one. Is it the same terms? We don't know yet. Second thing is Israel going to sign up on this? Is it going to sign up to it? Because if the terms are different, then it's quite possibly going to get rejected by the Israeli side. And those wonderful celebrations you saw there in Rafah and the Gaza Strip could be premature.
What are the odds of this leads to an actual ceasefire? No, it's not happening. Israel already said no. Israel said, we're moving in. Currently, as we are talking, Israeli tanks are already moving through the Gaza Strip and have already started firing in the direction of Rafah. Israel said, nah, we're not going to do that actually, and moved on. Yeah, Israel denied the ceasefire. Hamas accepted a ceasefire proposal, but Israel said it was unacceptable. Again, they did this again and again and again. Why would they do anything different? America didn't do in this entire process, in the process of invading. I saw reports they did, but the news orgs are saying Israel's deliberating on it. If they're deliberating on it, I'll tell you this much, they're violating it right now. Update from Al Jazeera, Reuters, Israeli press. An Israeli official has indicated that Israel will not be accepting the Qatari-Egyptian ceasefire deal that Hamas accepted today. Israeli official indicates rejection of ceasefire proposal. Report: an unnamed Israeli official quoted by the Reuters news agency says Hamas approved a softened Egyptian proposal that is not acceptable to Israel. The official added that the proposal included far-reaching conclusions that Israel will not support. Israeli media outlets are also reporting that the Israeli government has not accepted the deal. A reminder that we do not yet have the specifics of the deal that Hamas has agreed to. Hamas agreed to the latest proposal presented by Israel on April 27th, and there is no change in its elements. An official matter to Reuters, by the way. So they're saying that this was a weakened deal, but the source of the caveat in the negotiations, the new outline does not require Hamas to release 33 hostages, and their number will be determined later. Wait, where is this from? Is this recent? There will be a telephone meeting of the war cabinet later tonight. Israeli officials, translation, Netanyahu, are trying their best to give the media to bite on as far as how this deal is different. For example, they're just trying to say that it's not the same deal that they presented on April. Breaking: the Prime Minister's office of the war cabinet unanimously decided that Israel continues the operation in Rafah to exert military pressure on Hamas in order to advance the release of our hostages and the other goals of the war, which is a insane thing to state because the goal is ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and every single person, Israeli Jews right now, are protesting by the tens of thousands of streets for the past couple of months now, demanding that there be a ceasefire so that their friends and family members can get out. Nobody will believe what they are saying unless they are incredibly motivated in like defending Benjamin Netanyahu's political career, unless they're incredibly motivated in the genocide and don't really give about the hostages, the Israeli hostages that are currently trapped inside of Gaza, being brutalized by Israeli military actions. You know, nobody buys the unless you're an American media person, in which case you will buy it. You'll be like, oh, it seems like they just want to take the hostages out. More breaking: Prime Minister's office. Although the Hamas proposal is far from Israel's necessary requirements, Israel will send a delegation of working-class mediators to exhaust the possibility of reaching an agreement under conditions acceptable to Israel. But they're also bombing Rafah. It seems like they're moving into Rafah. So how the does that work? All right, Mohammed Al-Safin has more details. Hamas leader Khalil Hayya is on Al Jazeera explaining that the terms Hamas has agreed to, TLDR, three-stage truce, each builds on the other one. First stage would include the release of the first group of Israelis on day 3, coinciding with the retreat of Israeli forces from Rashid Street to Salahuddin Street. The retreat would allow Gaza to freely move via Rashid Street between North and South Gaza for the first time since the invasion, a key Hamas demand. On day 21st, Israeli forces would retreat fully from Salahuddin to outside Gaza. These are the terms of the Egyptian Qatari proposal. CIA head Burns was in Doha when this deal was brought forward. To be clear, Israel hasn't responded to this, but the deal seems to be what the mediators want. Asked about what the proposal says about prisoner swap, Hayya said, "We want our prisoners to come home and the Israelis to go home too, because we then would have no need to hold them. There has been an agreement on prisoner swap by day 35 of the truce. Details to be worked out until then. We initially demanded the release of 500 Palestinian prisoners for each female Israeli soldier and agreed to lower that to 50 for one. Okay. Female soldiers and older men in our custody would be released in first stage. The price of release of Israeli male soldiers will be different." Israelis are also protesting right now on the streets. Thousands of Israelis are protesting in the streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and throughout the country, demanding Israeli government accept ceasefire deal and release the abductees. I wanted to show you something directly from them as well. So this is unpopular for understandable reasons. It's unpopular if you believe Palestinians are human beings, right? It's unpopular because it just, continues the ethnic cleansing campaign. It's unpopular if you are an Israeli person who has like friends and family members or care about the Israeli hostages that are currently trapped inside of Gaza. It's unpopular for a broad swath of the Israeli society. It's only popular for the Bibis and people to the right of the Bibis. It's also popular for, I guess, like some of the IDF liberal libtard generals, the libtard generals that are like supposed to be like center left figures in Israeli politics, like Benny Gantz and whatnot. They have been gung-ho about continuing the ethnic cleansing nonstop. They have been some of the most aggressive forces. This does not mean that doing ethnic cleansing to the Palestinians is unpopular in Israel. It is not. It is very popular to do ethnic cleansing to the Palestinians in Israel. Okay? It is very popular. It's been 80+% amongst the Israeli Jewish population specifically since October 7 to keep bombing and bombing and bombing over and over again, mercilessly and relentlessly. However, they do want to take their civilians out. That's the key here. That's the key difference here. If all of the hostages were returned into Israel and then Israel turned around and were like, all right, it's time to put the slaughter machine back on, it would be 99%. So when I say this decision to invade Rafah and to bomb Rafah is unpopular in the eyes of many in Israel, I'm simply talking about in terms of the hostages still being there, okay? Family members still being there. Tanks have already crossed into Rafah at this point. The Israeli population, time and time again, that they are not even remotely interested in the Palestinian plight. Yeah, IDF's official statement as of now is IDF forces are now attacking and operating against the targets of the terrorist organization Hamas in a targeted manner in Mizrah, Rafah. More details to come. Here is directly on the ground. Israel blocks roads and protests against the Israeli government, demanding Netanyahu agree to the ceasefire deal that Hamas agreed to today. Yeah, this was the video I wanted to show you. Families of Israeli detainees in Gaza talking about Hamas agreeing to the deal. The government must agree now, otherwise we will burn the country. I don't think that they will do that, but just want you to understand that, like, even people who are fully on board with the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, especially even in Rafah, are still like, bro, save the hostages first. I don't want to die. I don't want to watch this, because if I have to see Karine Jean-Pierre say the dumbest I've ever heard in my entire goddamn life one more time. If they enter Rafah, what's Biden's response likely to be? What do you mean if? As it stands, the IDF has officially admitted that they are definitely entering Rafah. You don't mean if. I think you mean they are doing that currently. There will be no response. I'm sure that Biden will say meanie bobini words about Benjamin Netanyahu later, or rather they'll leak it to the media that he said mean things about him and how mad he is. The only thing that the American government has done thus far that I actually legitimately consider to be like a, you know, too little too late, but still relatively strong, no longer re-upping their ammunition. What happened 9 hours ago? Biden administration is pausing ammunition shipments to Israel. What the happened? The Biden administration halted a shipment of ammunition bound for Israel last week, Axios first reported, as pressure rises to hold Israel accountable. Biden administration last week put a hold on shipment of U.S.-made ammunition to Israel, two Israeli officials told Axios. This is the first time since October 7th that the U.S. has stopped a weapon shipment intended for the Israeli military. The incident raised serious concerns inside the Israeli government and sent officials scrambling to understand why the shipment is held. Biden is facing sharp criticism among Americans who oppose the support for Israel. The administration in February, Israel to provide assurances that the U.S.-made weapons were being used by the IDF in Gaza in accordance with international law. Israel provided a signed letter of assurances in March, except they never actually gave a full assessment of how they were using the weapons at all. That never actually came back. The Israeli officials said the ammunition shipment to Israel was stopped last week. The White House declined to comment. The Pentagon, the State Department, and the Israeli Prime Minister's office didn't immediately respond to the questions. I suspect that they did this. I might be wrong, but I thought that the reason why they did this is because they're trying to basically say, you know, if you invade Rafah, you know, we're going to cut you off. We've told you time and time again. They still did it, partially because we've given them enough weapons already, I assume, and partially because I suspect that they will defend Israel unconditionally no matter what. Why would Benjamin Netanyahu not do another you? Why would Benjamin Netanyahu not just say you to Biden? Benjamin Netanyahu and the war cabinet and the Israeli government as a whole literally engaged in the largest amount of land acquisition, largest amount of settlement expansion when Anthony Blinken was in Israel. If you think that that wasn't deliberate, if you think that that wasn't actually a you move to him, Anthony Blinken was having a conversation with the Israeli war cabinet. The Israeli government on the other side was taking over acres of Palestinian land. They did that on purpose. Ali Velshi breaking: the White House halted a large shipment of offensive weapons to Israel last week as the IDF ramped up a ground invasion of Rafah, according to two senior administration officials familiar with the decision. As you guys know, this was reported on by Axios as well. Obviously, America's pressure came too little, too late. Chatters, there are 27,000 of you in here. Always remember what happened on a day like this, what the terms and conditions were, what the ceasefire negotiation looked like over the course of the past 7 months, and how the media covered it. Why do I say remember? This should allow you to basically peek in to the past and reconsider everything you to have heard about the so-called peace process, because the way that the media has covered this, they are ruthless barbarians. They're monsters. They never want to concede. They never want to listen to reason. Anthony Blinken, time and time again, every single media appearance Anthony Blinken has made over and over again, Hamas is the one that does not want to concede to the quite reasonable terms and conditions that Israel has set forward. That this causes you to at the very least, reconsider what you may or may not have heard about the so-called peace process and how it was always the Palestinians that ruined it. Israel could not find a partner in peace, because that was too, and many more knowledgeable people with direct insight into the matter have spoken on this, and yet it doesn't matter. The narrative is set. Breaking: President Biden just secured a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. It is because of President Biden's leadership that this conflict is halting for the time being. What a wonderful picture. What a wonderful analogy to how unimaginably asleep at the wheel the Biden administration is. This is the exact same way the dogs in the media reported the Camp David summit, ignoring the fact that Israel wanted Palestinians to give more of their land in Jerusalem, only accepting custodianship, ignoring the fact that the two-state solution is already a compromise and the Arafat would be assassinated if he dared to accept that consent being manufactured once again. Exactly. And it doesn't even matter. Benjamin Netanyahu has time and time again said that he was sabotaging the peace negotiations deliberately. He ran on sabotaging the peace negotiations deliberately. He won on saying that he was going to sabotage the peace negotiations deliberately, and actually did sabotage the peace negotiations deliberately. And yet, we still have the audacity to lie about the historical record. The World Food Program Director Cindy McCain has officially stated that northern Gaza is in a full-blown famine. Here, let's take a look at that as well. There are hundreds of thousands of people in northern Gaza right now.
Let's talk about the World Food Program. That you have provided aid to 1.4 million people every month since the start of the war, but the war is nearly in its 7th month. How dire is the humanitarian crisis on the ground right now in Gaza?
Well, whenever you have conflict like this and emotions rage high and things happen in a war, famine happens. And so what I can explain to you is that there's famine, full-blown famine in the north, and it's moving its way south. And so with what we're asking for and what we continually ask for is a ceasefire and the ability to have unfettered access to get in, safe and unfettered access to get into Gaza, to various ports and various gate crossings.
As the director of the World Food Program, this is a pretty damning statement, which the Meet the Press exclusive MSNBC reporter will reiterate how important it is that she is saying this, okay? She's using diplomatic language while still saying something very important, the truth about what is going on in Gaza.
It hasn't always worked that way. It's been a very difficult run, and I'm so proud of our people on the ground there because it's dangerous, and they continue to deliver.
I just want to be very clear because what you're saying is significant, and I believe it's the first time we've heard it. You're saying there is full-blown famine,
yes,
in northern Gaza.
I am. Yes, I am.
And there has not been an official declaration that there is famine, but you are saying that based on what you've seen.
Yes, it is. Based on what we've seen and what we've experienced on the ground, yes. Which is,
This is the executive director of an important international organization.
It's horror.
That's a big deal because up until now, UN and everyone else has been saying it's in the brink of famine.
I'm so hoping that we can get a ceasefire and begin to feed these people, especially in the north, in a much faster fashion, but also including, as I said, water, sanitation, medicine. It's all part of the famine issue. And it's also something that we need to make sure that the world understands. We can't let this happen. In this day and age, when the world has the ability to feed itself 10 times over, nobody should starve. Nobody should starve.
Yeah.
Need medical. Switching max. Folding.
Hulk Hogan is one of the greatest and most influential wrestlers of all time. He's also one of the most recognizable pop culture figures of the last 50 years. At one point, he had an adoring audience in the millions, but in recent years, wrestling fans have slowly turned on him. Some of the blame can be placed on the numerous scandals that have taken a toll on his reputation. His backstage politicking and refusal to put other wrestlers over has also negatively affected the way he's now perceived by fans. That said, an element that cannot be ignored is Hogan's unparalleled ability to bend the truth. Despite working in an industry filled with storytellers where the line between fact and fiction often blurs, Bollea stands out from the crowd as one of the greatest liars in pro wrestling history. The sheer breadth and depth of his dishonesty is titanic. Countless videos, articles, Reddit posts, and message board discussions have been devoted to this subject alone. Even this lengthy video will only be scratching the surface, but it's a topic so interesting that I felt the need to make a video about it. Because investigating just one lie often reveals layers and layers of even more lies that lead you down a rabbit hole so deep you begin to wonder why he would do any of this. A good place to start would be with one of Hogan's most well-known lies. That being the story of how he was supposed to be the original spokesperson for what would become the George Foreman Grill. It's a story that sounds very plausible when you first hear it. Maybe you've even heard this from someone in the past and believed it. The problem is, it appears that Hogan made it up. The Hulkster has told two entirely different versions of how he supposedly missed out on the George Foreman Grill. He claimed that he left his house early to get some McDonald's and beat all of the soccer moms when it came time to pick up his kids from school.
I went home, hit the answer machine, and it was Sam Perlmutter, the guy that handled a lot of stuff for me and George. He goes, "Hey, Hogan, I got two things. I got a grill and a blender for you, you know."
And when he called Sam back, George had already taken the grill.
George took the grill.
The $300 million grill.
And it made $300 million.
Hogan was left with a mixer that would go on to be marketed as the, admittedly cool-sounding, Hulk Hogan Thunder Mixer. Despite the fact that this story doesn't make any sense and that's not how these deals work, many articles have reported Hogan's story to be true. But Hogan has told an entirely different version of the story that contradicts this one. In 2011, he claimed that his agent came to him with the offer to endorse a meatball maker or a grill, and Hogan was so enamored with the meatball maker idea that he told his agent to give the grill to one of his other clients, who would end up being George Foreman. Curiously, both of these entirely different stories also contradict the story told by the man who invented the George Foreman grill himself, Michael Bohn. According to Bohn, he sent a sample to someone he knew was working with George Foreman. Foreman was endorsing mufflers at the time, and Bohn wanted to know if he was interested in endorsing something else. However, Foreman wasn't sold on the grill, and he basically forgot about it for months until his wife got involved and he agreed to be the spokesperson for the Lean Mean grilling machine, earning hundreds of millions of dollars in the process.
So if you like your food lean, mean, and tasty, don't forget to pick up one on your way out.
From this side of the story, it seems pretty obvious that the makers of the grill were targeting Foreman specifically and were willing to wait months for him to agree. So neither of Hogan's stories really match up with what is arguably the most reliable narrative. For his part, Foreman hasn't said much on the topic other than saying that Hogan is one of his best friends. Either way, the Hulkster would end up getting his own grill, the Hulk Hogan Ultimate Grill.
Hey guys, I'm Hulk Hogan. Stay with me for the next half hour. I'm gonna show you my latest invention, Hulk Hogan's Ultimate Grill. Brother.
It would eventually be recalled due to being a fire hazard. The George Foreman grill story is a good place to start this video because it illustrates several themes common to Hogan's lies. At first, it doesn't seem far-fetched. It could almost be believable if Terry didn't choose to lie about something with an established origin story, and if he didn't tell multiple different versions of the story that undercut his credibility. You can see the same traits in Bollea's stories about his athletic past. On more than one occasion, he has told almost verbatim the same story about being scouted by the New York Yankees and Cincinnati Reds, before suffering an unfortunate elbow injury.
I ran up and picked up a blonde, threw it underhanded at first base, and broke that little cap on my elbow, so my arm was never the same.
Again, it sounds plausible. Lots of pro wrestlers have had athletic careers before cinching up a pair of wrestling boots and stepping into the ring. A notable example would be Randy Savage, who played for several seasons in the minor leagues. The idea that Hogan had a successful high school baseball career before suffering an injury isn't that hard to believe, but a believable lie is never enough to him, so he had to say wild shit like he had a .714 batting average when he competed in the Little League World Series. Who does this guy think he is, Joshua Fabia? The Hulkster probably assumed that there weren't any records to prove his story wrong, but the Little League World Series actually has a record of every kid who ever competed, and Terry Bollea is nowhere to be found. As you've probably started to grasp, a lot of Hogan's tall tales start with something plausible but become wilder and wilder until he ends up telling blatant lies and getting fact-checked. For another example, let's look at some of his stories from his days in the movie industry. Hogan has claimed that he rewrote the scripts for a number of movies he worked on. Most notably, he claimed in his 2002 autobiography that he and Vince McMahon completely rewrote the script for No Holds Barred, but didn't receive writing credits for it because they weren't in the Writers Guild. If you've ever seen the movie No Holds Barred, this actually seems believable, even more so when you read that the end fight scene, which involves a man getting electrocuted ass first, apparently came to Hogan in a dream while he fell asleep on the toilet. The stories become harder and harder to believe when he says things like Robert Evans, the head of Paramount, wanted to turn him into the next John Wayne. The problem here is that even at the earliest, Robert Evans would have been out as head of Paramount for at least a decade by the time this alleged meeting took place. Maybe Terry talked to a guy about a movie deal while eating at a Bob Evans and he got confused. It's not as ridiculous as Hogan's claim that he was offered the lead role of Randy the Ram in The Wrestler, but turned it down because he thought the movie was too good and he would ruin its credibility. Very humble Hulk. Only the film's director, Darren Aronofsky, has directly said that this is not true, because of course it isn't. It's not even the first time he said he's turned down a role in a big Hollywood production. According to Hogan, there's an alternate reality where he played Connor McLeod in Highlander, and there was some very real script for a movie where he was supposed to play a cop with Pamela Anderson as his love interest and Brad Pitt as a partner who dies in the line of duty. I just want you to take a moment to picture how fucking awful that would be. Okay. As silly and hilarious as Hogan's lies can often be, they don't all paint him as a buffoonish storyteller who's caught up in his own imagination. Some of these lies have had a genuine impact on his reputation. Such was the case in the early 90s when his name was tied to a growing steroid scandal among professional wrestlers. In June of 1991, Dr. George Zahorian III was convicted on 8 counts of distributing steroids and 4 counts of illegally distributing painkillers. Zahorian was the ringside physician for the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission and, as was revealed during the trial, had been supplying professional wrestlers with the substances. Several wrestlers testified that they purchased steroids from Zahorian after it was made illegal to distribute them in 1988. Zahorian himself also admitted that he sold steroids to several wrestlers, including Hulk Hogan and the men who testified. Hogan, who was initially listed as John Doe to protect his identity, was supposed to testify, but was excused at the last minute. Despite avoiding the witness stand, Bollea was now linked with the steroid case. He attempted to clear his name by appearing on the Arsenio Hall show in what he would later refer to in his autobiography as his biggest mistake. In fairness to Hulk, I'm sure he thought this would be his biggest mistake back in 2002. Hogan's appearance on Arsenio Hall was extremely awkward and unconvincing. He opened up by admitting that he had a prior history with Zahorian.
I was one of the patients of this doctor, and then later on down the line, he get into all these other things, but...
I'm no lawyer, but that seems like the kind of thing you would try to avoid saying at all costs. Aside from saying basically about 50 times in 10 minutes,
Basically, I've been a sling. So basically, I made the right decision. Well, basically, I'd rather not comment on that.
He trotted out many of the excuses used by fake natties that we are familiar with today. He claimed that he had always been big ever since he was a boy.
You were my size then.
I was 196 pounds when I was 10 years old. When I graduated from high school, I was 300 pounds, and right now I'm about 295.
He also said that he was offended by people speculating about his PED use because it took so much hard work to achieve his physique.
So basically, I was insulted, and basically I've trained 20 years, 2 hours a day to look like I do.
He wasn't a steroid user, and he didn't use steroids. But he did use them as prescribed by a doctor as part of a sports therapy program to recover from injuries, on 3 occasions.
On 3 different occasions, I had the same type of muscle injuries. That is the extent of Hulk Hogan's steroid use.
It was all bullshit, though. After this interview, Hogan would be publicly called out by fellow wrestlers Superstar Billy Graham and David Schultz. Graham claimed that when he met Bollea in the mid-70s, Terry approached him and asked for advice on taking the substances, a story he reiterated 20 years later in an interview with the Hannibal TV.
How do I become a professional wrestler, and how do I take steroids? Oh, he told me he'd been taking steroids for 1 full year at the time I met him.
Schultz went even further, saying he injected Bollea well over 100 times and that sometimes he took 12 cc's 3 times a week.
All you should do is come out and tell them the truth. Quit lying to them. Tell them the truth and be man enough to tell them the truth, and say, hey, I did steroids.
Eventually, the bad press associated with Hogan reached the point that he was placed on a leave of absence from the WWF in April of 1992. In spite of this fact, and Hogan ultimately leaving the WWF and later signing with their chief rival, WCW, Hogan's name would be tied to the scandal for several years.
Some people now claim that his hard-muscled good guy image really came from his past use of dangerous drugs.
In December of 1993, Vince McMahon was indicted on charges of distributing steroids due to cooperation from Dr. George Zahorian. This time, Hogan would actually testify, under immunity from prosecution, of course. Although Hogan admitted that PED use was fairly common in the Federation and that he used McMahon's secretary as a sort of go-between for Dr. Zahorian, he said that Vince never purchased PEDs for him or ordered him to take them. McMahon was ultimately acquitted of the distribution charges, but the reputation of the WWF and pro wrestling as a whole was tarnished by the steroid scandal. For his part, Hogan would reveal more and more about his PED use as time went by. In his first autobiography, he said that he probably started taking steroids in 1975, but at the time, every wrestler he knew took them, and they were being used by athletes in every sport. Quote, "Nobody said, here, stick this in your ass or eat this pill, it'll kill you. Nobody told us that if you took steroids for 30 years, it could be harmful to your long-term health. I never had a question about whether I would take them. It was part of my daily regimen. Did you take a shower today? Yeah. Did you brush your teeth? Yeah. Did you take your steroids today? Yeah. Okay, let's go. That was the deal. It was how I lived." End quote. On one hand, it is easy to empathize with Hulk Hogan on this issue. Almost every athlete is on something for reasons Hulk even went into in his book. The overwhelming majority of pro wrestlers at the time were on them, but Hogan was singled out because he was so famous and popular.
The paper speculated when my name got thrown in the ringer, it turned into the Hulk Hogan trial, and they didn't direct the focus on what this thing was all about.
On the other hand, it was Hogan's popularity that made it so galling when he went into Arsenio Hall and told everyone that he was a goody-good boy whose body was the result of training, saying his prayers, and eating his vitamins.
And my theme is if you train, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, and believe in yourself, just like I have done, brother, you can have everything you want out of life, and I'm not ashamed of anything I've done.
And a teeny tiny bit of steroids. Only 3 times. Didn't you guys see how big he was when he was 10? That's all natural, brother. Hogan lying about his PED use was so unconscionable because, maybe more than any other wrestler, he was associated with kids. While the guy was sticking needles in his ass, his likeness was being used to sell children's vitamins.
Hulk Hogan Vitamins, the new champion of children's chewables.
I don't know if it's possible to come up with a more cynical juxtaposition than that to show the duplicitous nature of Hulkamania. As far as Hulkster lies go, it's still pretty far from being the worst. In the end, Hogan himself was the main casualty of these lies. The same cannot be said for some of his other deceits. Let's take a look at the infamous incident at Survivor Series 1991, where Hogan claimed that Mark Calloway, better known as The Undertaker, injured him. Even though Undertaker's side of the story wouldn't come out for 30 years, I think we should discuss it first, because he mentioned the events leading up to it as well. In The Undertaker's version of events, Hogan was already mentioning his neck backstage for hours before the fight.
So he's telling me, he goes, "Hey, I got this neck injury." He says, "I'm really nervous about taking your finish." And
to which Taker assured him that he would hold Hogan so tight that nothing could happen.
"I promise you, I will have you so tight that there's no way possible that you're going to hurt your neck."
When they eventually went for the tombstone spot in the match, Hogan claimed that Taker injured him.
As soon as my knees hit, I hear, "Oh, you got me, brother."
As Calloway recalls, he genuinely believed that he had hurt Hogan and was afraid that he had killed the Golden Goose, a fear that only got worse as Hulk apparently played up the injury in the aftermath.
And then I hear, "Somebody get my wife and kids on the phone."
The following Tuesday, Mark would get the chance to rewatch the match and notice that Hogan's head came nowhere near the chair. Subsequently, he confronted Hogan as respectfully as he could.
"Terry, I watched it back. Your head never hit."
Hogan's response was that when Taker went for the tombstone, he held Hulk so tightly that it jammed his neck because he couldn't move.
That's what jammed my neck, because I couldn't move at all.
I think it's important to see the Undertaker's side of the story first, because he has no reason to be dishonest here. If anything, he's merely setting the record straight on a story that Hogan has told about him for several decades, with each retelling contradicting the others. In his 2002 autobiography, Bollea said that Ric Flair slipped a chair into the ring and The Undertaker hit him with a pile driver on top of the chair. Quote, "He also screwed my neck up something fierce. It wasn't his fault. He took care of me and made sure my head didn't hit the mat. But the jolt of my neck being stretched like that sent me right to the hospital. I was in there for a couple of days. Everybody wanted to fuse the discs in my neck together, but I decided against it. It would be years before I got all the feeling back in my arms. But 6 days later, I was wrestling The Undertaker again in a special pay-per-view rematch called Tuesday in Texas, because Ric Flair's interference had made the title null and void." End quote. During a 2006 episode of Hogan Knows Best, he would change this story and give what is the most insane version of events.
I feel like I got the neck brace on after The Undertaker spiked me on the concrete in Detroit in '74.
Whatever truth there may be to Hogan's story of potentially being injured during this match, he definitely wasn't spiked on the concrete by The Undertaker in 1974, because A, that didn't happen, and B, Mark Calloway was 9 years old in 1974. This version of events is so odd even for Hulk Hogan that I think he might have just had a stroke or something while he was saying it, because it makes no sense whatsoever. By the time 2009 rolled around and Hogan released his second book, My Life Outside the Ring, he dialed back the insanity, but this version of events still contradicted the one from his first book. In this retelling, Hogan said that Taker dropped his head on the metal chair in the nastiest tombstone of all tombstones. This was all apparently part of the plan, according to Hogan. What wasn't part of the plan was how sweaty Hogan was, and as a result, when Taker dropped the tombstone on him, his skull made contact with the chair, and the jolt of the whole move threw his neck out. I'm putting all of that in quotations, by the way. Hogan would go on to say that after eschewing doctor-advised surgery on his neck, he went to a chiropractor in Tampa, and after 6 months of hard work and deep tissue massage therapy, he was able to get back to some sense of normalcy. According to Hogan, the repercussions of that move have never gone away. The backs of his triceps were still a little numb, and he couldn't feel anything in the tips of his fingers, which made it difficult to tie his bandanas or button his shirts. This again directly contradicts what he said in his first book. Quote, "It would be years before I got all the feeling back in my arms." End quote. Over the next few years, Hogan would change and tweak the story while keeping the broad strokes of it the same. During a 2010 interview with Michael "The Voice" Schiavello, Hogan admitted that when he watched the tape of the match, he realized his head didn't hit the mat.
But I looked the tape back, and my head never hit.
However, he attributed the jerk of the move to his neck injury and claimed to not have any feeling in his shoulders, triceps, or hands.
I still don't have any feeling in my shoulders or my triceps or my hands are numb.
Wow.
A little later, he claimed that the injury wasn't anyone's fault.
Because my head didn't hit. It wasn't like he dropped me or I slipped. It wasn't anything like that. It was just the jerk. So my neck not being strong enough.
Funny how we've gone from, "Ow, you got me, brother," to "It wasn't like he dropped me or I slipped. It wasn't anything like that." The story does get even more interesting, though. Back in January of 2013, Hogan filed a $50 million medical malpractice lawsuit against the Laser Spine Institute, claiming that they persuaded him to undergo multiple ineffective spinal procedures that made his back problems worse. During the deposition for the case, Hogan, being under oath, gave what is presumably the most truthful version of the story, from his side at least. When he was directly questioned about his previous statements, calling the tombstone from The Undertaker the straw that slaughtered the camel's back, he said he didn't remember writing that. When asked if he said the tombstone was the nastiest tombstone of all tombstones that caused his neck, calves, shoulder, biceps, triceps, and forearms to go numb, Hogan said that wasn't completely accurate. Hogan was further asked if he had claimed that the repercussions for Undertaker's tombstone in 1991 had never gone away, and Hogan gave some strange story about how he regained feeling in his hands after burning them on a radiator, but also said that he had adapted to the numb fingers by learning to tie bandanas and button shirts differently. Overall, this story is pretty weird. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Hogan did get his neck jammed or tweaked during the match with The Undertaker at Survivor Series. It doesn't take a lot of direct force to hurt your neck, and apparently he was hospitalized after the match for real. It's also quite possible that he has some numbness in his hands, but he has had many injuries and multiple spinal surgeries throughout his long career. The problem is that he has told so many conflicting versions of this story, some of them being so outlandishly wrong that you wonder how he came up with them in the first place. If The Undertaker is to be believed, and there is no reason to think he's lying about this, Hogan also changed his story when confronted with evidence, but still maintained that Taker had injured him, seemingly just so that Hogan could have something to hold over his head.
You know, I was like, okay. I kind of realized, okay, I know what you're all about, and that's all I needed, you know.
Then, years later, he reverted back to the story about being tombstoned onto a steel chair, even though he had long since known it never happened that way. This is a pretty abridged version of the story, too. David Bixenspan wrote a lengthy post about this on Substack that I cribbed pretty heavily for the video. I would suggest checking the post out, though, because he does go over the story in more detail. At the end of the day, it's sort of a boy who cried wolf situation. Hogan has lied about the story so much that there is no way to know when he's actually telling the truth. That is a pretty common thing with him that will become a running theme as we get deeper into this video. Time and time again, he is able to find the borderlands between fact and fiction. He can take a story with a grain of truth and weave it into a narrative that seems plausible enough at first glance. Although, upon closer inspection, it reveals a tangled web of exaggerations, if not outright lies. A prime example of this phenomenon would be Hogan's history of claiming to be involved in so-called shoot fights. In 2009, he told Anthony Cumia's arch-enemy Boomer Esiason that during his time in Japan in the 1970s, he faced off with a lot of pride fighters and didn't know whether he would be getting into the ring with a shooter or not. This was a point that he reiterated in 2023 during an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he again stated that he wrestled with pride guys in the 70s. There's a pretty big problem here. Pride didn't hold its first event until 1997. If that wasn't enough, Hogan also claimed that he was offered a spot in the first UFC event but turned it down because, quote, it was very violent and the referees weren't stopping matches and letting guys get beat up when they should have been stopped, end quote. That said, shortly after Hulk made this claim in April of 2015, UFC co-founder Campbell McLaren said it was bullshit and he never asked Hogan to be in the UFC. As far as I know, nobody has come forward to corroborate Hogan's claim, but the rabbit hole goes even deeper. In the 2004 WWE DVD, Hulk Still Rules, Hogan made the bizarre assertion that one of his matches with Tatsumi Fujinami was an out-and-out shoot, implying that Fujinami was trying to beat him for real and take the WWF title. Only there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support this, other than the Hulkster's word. Hogan only wrestled Fujinami a handful of times as far as I can tell, and none of the available footage looks like anything other than a worked wrestling match. It's a case where Hogan can't be 100% proved wrong, but the story simply doesn't add up. I'd argue that this is why so many of Hogan's shoot-fight-related stories stem from his days in Japan. With the line between work and shoot sometimes blurring in those days, there is some degree of plausible deniability, and unlike with many of his other lies, he can't be fully proven wrong. This is where we come to the story of Koji Kitao and John Tenta, another famous shoot fight that occurred in Japan in the 90s. In April of 1991, the WWF put on a show with the Japanese wrestling promotion Super World of Sports called Wrestle Dream. One of the matches from this card between Koji Kitao and John Tenta, aka Earthquake, has become quite infamous over the years because of the way it devolved into a legit shoot. Both men were at one time sumo wrestlers. Kitao made the rank of Yokozuna before being forced to retire amid controversies that aren't really germane to this video. Tenta started as an amateur wrestler in his home country of Canada, but later became an NCAA-level wrestler for LSU, as well as playing football and rugby. In his early 20s, he became a sumo wrestler and would amass a 24-match unbeaten streak in 8 months. However, he would ultimately quit sumo due to the physical demands of the sport and potentially the fact that he would have needed to get a skin graft to remove the large tattoo on his arm. This shared background in sumo has led some people to believe that the match went south because Kitao did not want to lose to a lower-ranked sumo wrestler, but this matter still remains somewhat of a mystery. The match started off pretty normally, but it began to go south around the 3-minute mark when Tenta grabbed a waistlock and Kitao appeared to genuinely hand-fight him and refused to work. Shortly afterward, Tenta manhandled Kitao to the ground and covered him. Kitao escaped by scurrying under the ring ropes, and from this point on, chaos ensued. Kitao threw a table at the ring in frustration while the crowd booed him. He eventually got back in the ring, but the atmosphere had become much more tense. For several minutes, they mostly circled each other, with Tenta attempting to initiate worked wrestling scenarios and Kitao trying to grapple for real while throwing shoot kicks at John. For much of his match, Kitao had his right hand cocked up with 2 fingers extended, and on multiple occasions he attempted to go for Tenta's eyes. After several more minutes of tense circling and shoot kicks from Kitao, Tenta shouted at him, appearing to say, "Who do you think you are? This is pro wrestling." After this, the footage cut to a package declaring Tenta the winner by disqualification, but footage from the crowd showed Kitao kick the referee. After being disqualified, Kitao left the ring and grabbed a microphone, where he apparently proceeded to bury Tenta and the crowd and call wrestling fake. By this point, you're probably saying, I thought this was supposed to be a video about Hulk Hogan. How does he fit into all of this? In August of last year, Hogan appeared on This Past Weekend with Theo Von and claimed that he was supposed to be Koji Katao's original opponent.
So this sumo wrestler, who was his first night, the booker told this Japanese guy that he wanted him to put me over. He goes, "No, I'm not letting him win."
However, when they learned that Kitao intended to shoot on Hulk and beat him for real, John Tenta stepped in to take Hogan's place.
Big guy there from Vancouver named John Tenta called Earthquake. And him and I were really good friends. He goes, "No, Terry, you're not going out there. I am." As soon as Tenta went out there, this guy tried to hook his eye right away. And man, it pissed Tenta off. Tenta beat the shit out of him. I was like...
It's a story that seems to fit Tenta's reputation as a badass who could hold his own in a real fight, as well as being an all-around stand-up guy. But it probably didn't happen. I've seen some comments saying that other wrestlers confirmed Hogan's story, but I can't find them. Either way, it just doesn't add up logistically. Hogan did wrestle on the same card against Yoshiaki Yatsu in the main event for the WWF title. Tenta versus Kitao was the 4th to last match on the card, which means that if Hogan's version of events was accurate, he would have initially been facing Kitao in the main event for the WWF heavyweight belt. That seems like something people would have remembered about this already infamous story. Also, it means that they would have had to switch the bout order around, making a new main event sometime the night of the show, but no later than the 4th to last match on the card. Otherwise, Tenta would not have been able to volunteer himself to take Hogan's place against Kitao. But that isn't how Hogan describes it happening. He makes it seem like he was about to walk out to the ring for the match when Tenta stepped in, which just couldn't have happened. Additionally, if there is any promotional material from this card showing Hogan against Yoshiaki Yatsu in the main event, it would totally prove this story to be a lie. Honestly, the whole story is perplexing. Hogan's need to insert himself into this well-known event doesn't make sense. The fact that he waited until after John Tenta was dead to tell it just seems really craven and pathetic, especially because he says Tenta was a good friend of his. Even this isn't the most ridiculous story Hogan has told about being in a shoot fight, though. No, that goes to him saying he once boxed George Foreman for 3 rounds. As Hogan explained in his autobiography, his good friend George Foreman invited him down to Houston for a charity event at his youth center, which Hogan felt the need to point out was hot and not air-conditioned. But to Hulk's surprise, there was a boxing ring in the middle of the youth center, and unbeknownst to him, Foreman had told all of the kids that they were going to box for 3 rounds. Thankfully, Hogan had enough self-awareness not to claim that he was competitive in this boxing match. He basically said that Foreman was toying with him and still punched him in the arm hard enough to make his legs go numb. I don't understand the medical explanation for that, so maybe a doctor can explain it in the comments. What makes this story so preposterous to me is not the idea that Hulk Hogan got inside a boxing ring with George Foreman. It's the fact that there is apparently no evidence. Really think about that for a minute. Hogan and Foreman, sometime in the 90s, both global superstars still close to the peak of their notoriety, engage in a charity boxing match, and there is no evidence of it. Now, you might say that this was an impromptu sparring session for some kids at a youth center, so maybe there weren't any journalists around. Aside from the fact that even if this match happened in the deepest backwater ass crack of Cambodia, there probably would have been a guy with a Polaroid camera there to snap a couple of pictures for the Phnom Penh Post. Hogan says in his book that the fucking TV stations were there. I'm not saying this event 100% didn't happen. Maybe one day somebody will dust off an old VHS tape and it will be a news clip of Hogan and Foreman boxing. Maybe sitting right next to it will be footage of Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game too, or the alternate angle of the moon landing. As absurd as this story is, though, at least there is some infinitesimally small chance it's true. Hogan isn't lying wholesale about a well-known and documented event in history. You can't say the same about many of his other lies. Hogan's biggest and probably most well-known lie is less of a single lie in particular and more of an ongoing series of retcons regarding his legendary match with Andre the Giant at WrestleMania III. Over the years, Hogan has given dimensions for Andre that apparently range as high as 7 feet 4 inches tall and 800 pounds. But those numbers and the alleged injuries Hulk sustained during the lift have changed over time. In his 2009 memoir, he said that Andre was nearly 700 pounds and that lifting the Giant for the slam tore the muscles in his back. He seemingly ran with this just under 700 pound story for several years. When speaking to Bubba the Love Sponge, he said that they weighed Andre at a baggage claim at the airport in Detroit and he weighed 697 pounds. He also claimed that lifting Andre up for the slam tore all the muscles in his back as well as his shoulders and both triceps. In 2010, Hogan told a similar story to Michael Schiavello, but in this version, Andre was closer to 690 when they weighed him.
And we went to the airport and he got on the scales and you said over 600 pounds. He was actually closer to 7.
And lifting the Giant tore his back, both biceps and his delt in 3 places.
And when I turned him, it's, tore my back and it tore my bicep, it tore my delt in 3 places, but I turned him over.
2 years later, he would tell Get in the Game TV that he only tore the back muscle under his right armpit and both of his biceps.
I ripped my whole back out under my armpit, ripped both of my biceps. Now both of my biceps are torn if you get a close look at me, but I never had them fixed. That was...
In 2015, he was on the BS Report with Bill Simmons, and he dialed Andre's weight back a bit while maintaining that he was never only 500 pounds.
How tall was he, do you think?
He started out around 7'4". We weighed him at Detroit. At the airport before WrestleMania III, he was like 650 something. So, I mean, it's kind of like...
650?
Hogan would also go on to say that during the match he tore both of his biceps but flew to Japan the next day and wrestled for 8 or 9 days.
For my biceps, picking him up. Nowadays you get cut and put in a sling for 6 months, but I split the next day and went to Japan for like 8 or 9 days.
This seems to be the general story he stuck to, at least recently, as evidenced by his video with Men's Health.
As you can see, I never had my biceps fixed. I tore both of my biceps. And this part of my back is solid, but this part is all torn away.
The truth is, there is simply no indication that Andre was 600 pounds, even at his heaviest. And irrespective of Hulk's story about the magical baggage claim scale, he definitely did not get up to 700 pounds, let alone fucking 800. Hogan's claims about his injuries are still pretty dubious, but a little more plausible. He might have injured himself slamming Andre, but the idea that he injured his back and his shoulders and both biceps is ridiculous. In fact, the claim that he tore every muscle in his back at WrestleMania III and then wrestled in Japan for 29 days straight was something that was brought up in his medical malpractice deposition. Hogan was forced to admit that he only tore his lat muscle before going to Japan. Even still, there are problems with that story because there is no way he flew to Japan the day after WrestleMania III and wrestled for any amount of time. I guess it's not technically a lie because he did continue to wrestle in Japan several years later. There are elements of Hogan's side of the story that we know to be factually untrue, though. Hogan has claimed that this was the first time Andre had been body slammed, but that is simply false. Numerous wrestlers had slammed Andre dating back to the early 70s. This wasn't even the first time Hogan had slammed Andre. He had done so as far back as 1980. And he slammed Andre again at WrestleMania IV, which you'd think would be impossible if doing it the last time took such a heavy toll on the Hulkster's body. This isn't even the most absurd and factually incorrect statement Hogan has made about this match. During a 2005 episode of MTV Cribs, Hulk claimed that Andre died days after he slammed him.
I wrestled Andre the Giant with these boots on, and then a couple days later he passed on. These are my favorite pair of boots.
Andre would live for another 6 years and didn't even stop wrestling until 1992. With some of Hogan's lies, you can understand how he thought he might get away with them. With this one, I can't even begin to fathom it. We're talking about one of the most notable moments in wrestling history that featured 2 of the most famous wrestlers of all time. Even in a pre-internet era, it would be an unthinkable thing to try and lie about. But in 2005, it boggles the mind. Weirdly though, this isn't even the only time Hogan has tried to claim some kind of connection or outright involvement in another wrestler's death. In 1983, Hogan would wrestle Antonio Inoki for the original version of the IWGP title. Towards the end of their match, Hulk would go for the Axe Bomber, which was his finishing move in Japan. Inoki, who was standing on the apron of the ring, was violently knocked off and appeared to have been knocked unconscious. Hogan watched on in confusion as Inoki failed to rise despite numerous attempts to revive him that involved violently shaking his head and slapping him. Probably great for concussion, guys. Eventually, an honestly distraught-looking Hogan was named the winner of the match as Inoki was carried out on a stretcher. From my understanding, this is one of those instances in wrestling where the line between fact and fiction genuinely blurred. Whether Inoki had actually been knocked out by Hogan was uncertain, and based on Hogan's general demeanor as he watched the events unfold, he seemed pretty rattled by the whole situation. But it was a work, just a very, very sneaky work. During an episode of Talk is Jericho from November of 2022, Wrestling Observer's Dave Meltzer and wrestling historian Fumi Saito discussed the famous match between Hogan and Inoki. According to Saito, Antonio Inoki had been incredibly secretive about his interaction to pretend to be knocked out.
Not everybody had the same answer. That's how mysterious Inoki is. But the referee didn't know about it, Sakaguchi didn't know about it, Hulk Hogan didn't know about it, Inoki just decided to lay there, right?
Now, had Hulk Hogan simply run with the story that he thought he had knocked Inoki out and was shitting his pants thinking about the repercussions, I don't think anyone would have a problem with it. It's a more than entertaining story on its own. But this is Hulk Hogan we're talking about, so he had to take it even further. Back in 2008, he appeared on Bubba the Love Sponge's show and made it seem like Inoki had developed an ego after beating Muhammad Ali and started to believe he was a real shooter. If that weren't enough, Hogan then claimed that when he wrestled Inoki tried to shoot on him, so Hogan elbowed him in the temple and knocked him out. If you believe me, it actually gets worse. For the next 5 days, Hogan said he had his passport confiscated and was forced to switch hotels because of death threats. Only when Inoki finally held a press conference with Hulk from the hospital to let everyone know he was okay was Hogan allowed to leave the country. Is it possible that Hogan received death threats after the match? A segment of the population just isn't very bright. Did he get threatened by the Yakuza or have his passport confiscated until he did a press conference with Inoki? That I very much doubt, and my attempts to find a picture of this through Google, even in Japanese, didn't turn anything up. The fact of the matter is, Hulk Hogan did not knock Inoki out so badly that he had to be brought back from the brink of death and spend 5 days in the hospital. It was an incredibly well-executed and believable work, but a work nonetheless. Hogan's attempt to spin the incident as Inoki developing a big ego and trying to fight him for real is simply a lie. But it's far from the worst lie of this nature because he's also inserted himself into the real deaths of pro wrestlers. When Hogan appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience in August of 2023, he told many lies, but a few stood out. One was the story of his weird connection to the murder of Bruiser Brody. According to Hogan, he was wrestling in Puerto Rico, and after the event, he and Randy Macho Man Savage went back to Savage's dressing room and found it had been trashed. Hogan then went to his own dressing room where a man with a gun was waiting for him and said that if Hogan ever came back to Puerto Rico, he would kill him. Hogan immediately left Puerto Rico and flew all the way to California, but then claims that 4 months after this incident, Bruiser Brody was called into the bathroom by the booker and had his throat slit. As with many Hogan stories, there is a grain of truth buried in there somewhere. He did wrestle in Puerto Rico, and maybe a guy threatened him with a gun, but there is no proof one way or another, just Hogan's word, which is very questionable. Nevertheless, we know that the show Hogan referenced took place on October 19th, 1985. Brody was stabbed more than 2 years later on July 16th of 1988. Also, his throat was not slit, he was stabbed in the abdomen and died hours later. He was not found dead in the shower. This is still not the end of Hogan's inaccuracies, though. He claimed that Brody was killed after the match because he refused to put the Puerto Rican wrestlers over, but that's just factually untrue. The altercation happened before the event, and the other wrestlers weren't afraid to return to Puerto Rico for the trial as Hogan claimed. Wrestlers like Dutch Mantell and others who actually were there at the time of the murder received their subpoenas after the trial was over.
I've said before, my subpoena for the trial came in the day after they held it, because I looked at the date on the letter, and it was mailed 10 days before the trial, but the mail was so slow, it had just got to me where I was.
Moreover, the trial of Jose Gonzalez, aka Invader One, is viewed by many as being a sham trial due to his suspected political connections and status in Puerto Rico. Is it possible that Hogan was simply misremembering the events of this dark moment in pro wrestling history, and he got virtually everything wrong about it purely by accident? I guess, but then why even tell it in the first place if you're unsure of the details? Saying, yeah, brother, a guy pulled a gun on me, and a few years later, a guy named Bruiser Brody was killed by the Booker, is a scary enough story on its own. No need for embellishment or lying. Honestly, this just feels like Hulk Hogan's equivalent of saying he was supposed to get on one of the planes that was hijacked on 9/11, if he hasn't already made that claim somewhere. But as I've said before, it gets even worse. At least in this story, Hogan said there was a period of several months separating him from another wrestler's death. Not so with his lie about Kerry Von Erich. The story of the Von Erich family is a complex and deeply tragic one, but for the sake of brevity, we can't really get into it. Following a motorcycle accident and an amputation of his right foot, as well as drug and legal issues and his marriage falling apart, Kerry Von Erich became suicidal. Sadly, on February 18th of 1993, he took his own life on his father's property. Even though I'm leaving a tremendous amount out of the Kerry Von Erich story, I'm sure you can tell that it's extremely sad and tragic. All the more so because of its place in the even more sad and tragic story of the Von Erich family that has become a dark part of pro wrestling folklore. It's really not the kind of story that any person with a modicum of self-awareness, tact, or basic human decency would choose to insert themselves into. But this is Hulk Hogan we're talking about. During a 2010 appearance on Bubba the Love Sponge's program, Hogan would make the incredible claim to have been on a flight from Japan with Kerry Von Erich only 72 hours before his death. During this conversation, he said they talked about life and Kerry's brothers and his newborn baby. According to Hogan's side of the story, Kerry had no plans to end things at the time. There are numerous issues with this statement. The first is that Hogan's story doesn't match up at all with how Bret Hart described Kerry's mood in the period leading up to his death. Hart spoke about Kerry saying that his brothers were calling him and he wished to join them. Furthermore, this alleged 11-hour conversation during a flight back from Japan almost certainly did not happen. There is no record of either of them having matches in Japan during this time period. To make it even more unlikely, days before his death, Von Erich had been indicted on drug possession charges stemming from a January 13th arrest, and he was facing the revocation of his 10-year parole for a previous offense. So, the idea that he was flying back and forth between the US and Japan at this particular time seems very hard to believe. Hogan did claim to wrestle 400 days a year due to how often he crossed time zones while flying between the US and Japan, but outside of fucking time travel, this conversation appears to be impossible. Maybe Hogan and Von Erich crossed paths at some point during a flight to or from Japan, but it did not happen 72 hours before Kerry's death. Honestly, it was lies like this one that made me want to make this video. Many of Hogan's lies are inconsequential or genuinely hilarious, like saying on the radio that he had a 10-inch penis and then being forced to explain in court that he in fact did not.
Well, it's not mine, because mine isn't that size. But we were discussing the length of Hulk Hogan's.
Seriously? So...
No, seriously, I do not have a 10-inch penis. No, I do not. Seriously.
Fair enough.
But then there are some, like this, that the more you think about them, the darker they get. It's not just that he told an almost certainly false story about an infamous event in wrestling history. Kerry Von Erich was a real person whose life ended tragically. He was somebody's son, brother, father, and friend. People were permanently affected by his passing. To insert yourself into that story is so callous and self-absorbed that it's hard to wrap your head around. But it can get even worse. We have to discuss the Hulkster in heaven. For years, Hulk Hogan's musical career has been a subject of mockery among wrestling fans. In large part, this is due to some of Hogan's more absurd claims. Like, he was asked by his good friend Lars Ulrich to join Metallica, and also he tried to join the Rolling Stones. Justin Wang has a great video on the subject where he not only looks into Hogan's claims of almost joining Metallica and the Rolling Stones, but also examines his musical chops in general. I suggest you watch it if you want a more in-depth breakdown of these lies. It's a good video and was one of the things that inspired me to make this video. Suffice to say, Hogan was lying, and his story was contradicted by Lars himself.
Unless he went by like his Christian name or something. Now, I don't know if anybody knows what his Christian name was, Dave Smith or something. If there was a whole thing that we had with him under a different name, but I certainly have no recollection of doing anything with Hulk Hogan. Well, damn, that's a very different story from being big pals with Lars Ulrich.
Funnily enough, this is one of the few instances where Hogan was forced to backpedal on a story. Probably because someone similarly famous and influential actually called him out on it. With that in mind, Hogan has been involved in a number of more legitimate musical projects over the years. It's well known that before becoming a wrestler, Hogan was a musician and played bass for a band named Ruckus that was supposedly quite popular in the Tampa Bay area. His most successful musical project was probably 1995's Hulk Rules by Hulk Hogan and the Wrestling Boot Band. Well, that or his collaboration with Green Jelly where they covered Gary Glitter's I'm the Leader of the Gang. That one really aged well, huh, Hulk? Hulk Rules featured Hogan on vocals and bass, as well as his then wife Linda Bollea, J.J. Maguire, and Mouth of the South Jimmy Hart. As you can imagine, it's not a particularly great album and is generally remembered for the wrong reasons. I mean, Hogan literally facepalmed when it was brought up during an interview with Noisy. Were it not for one specific song, I doubt that Hulk Rules would be so controversial though. I am of course talking about Hulkster in Heaven. Without knowing the broader context, Hulkster in Heaven is an unintentionally funny song about a terminally ill Hulkamaniac, with ridiculous lines like, I read it in the papers, I saw it on TV. I guess there'll be one empty seat when I wrestle at Wembley. I didn't pronounce that incorrectly, Hulk did. I used to tear my shirt, but now you've torn my heart. I knew you were a Hulkamaniac right from the very start. End quote. The chorus is, if anything, even more insipid, with Hulk saying that when he gets to heaven and meets his friend, the two will tag up again. If you didn't know any better, this would seem like a cheesy, if weirdly touching tribute to a fallen Hulkamaniac. But of course, by this point, we do know better. According to Hogan in his 2002 biography, this song was a genuine tribute to a child who really did pass away. I'm going to read you the passage about the story from his autobiography, and I want you to pay attention to the level of compassion and the general tone with which this story is recounted by Hogan. Quote, in 1995, I came out with an album called Hulk Rules by Hulk Hogan and the Wrestling Boot Band. But really, the album was born back in 1992 at Wembley Stadium over in England. Before the show, which was sold out to the walls, I met a Make-A-Wish kid with cancer. He had a doctor and a nurse with him, a whole medical entourage. He was supposed to be sitting ringside when I went out to wrestle, but I didn't see him there. After the match, I came back and said, "Where's the kid?" They told me, oh, he died before the match got underway. Jimmy Hart was with me that night, so he sat down and wrote a song right away in the dressing room. Another Hulkamaniac in heaven. There's one empty seat in Wembley. The little Hulkamaniac that came to see me. It's a ballad, a slow song. Anyway, we sat up and wrote 10 or 11 songs that night, because once we wrote one, we were on a roll. The profits from the record sales went to the family of the kid who died. They were having trouble paying his medical bills, so we helped out. End quote. Did anybody else tear up just a little bit? It was so emotional, and you could tell that this real kid, who had a name that Hogan definitely remembers, was important to him. Hogan was clearly affected by the child's passing in a way that could only be relieved via an impromptu songwriting session. And just think of what a good guy Hogan is to donate all of the proceeds from the album to this kid's family to pay for his medical bills. Except it's all bullshit. Hogan never wrestled at Wembley Stadium in 1992. This is just a fact. At the time of the event in question, which would have been SummerSlam on August 29th, Hogan was on a hiatus that just coincidentally followed his interview with Arsenio Hall, where he poorly denied allegations that he used steroids. As with the alleged 11-hour flight with Kerry Von Erich, it's basically impossible that Hogan was anywhere near Wembley Stadium within the time frame he claims. And there are even more logistical issues with this story. Hogan claims that immediately after the match, he and Jimmy Hart started writing the tribute to the fallen Hulkamaniac. However, this claim was contradicted by J.J. McGuire, who said the song was actually written in 1994. Jimmy Hart corroborated this story as well, saying in the Noisy article that Hulk and everyone else there just chipped in, sat around for a few weeks, and wrote 10 songs. Hogan did wrestle at Wembley in 1994, and maybe a scenario like this played out, but Hulk's claim was that it was written in 1992, so no dice there. As far as the proceeds from the album going to the anonymous kid's family, there is simply no evidence of that happening whatsoever. And it doesn't make sense anyway, as the kid was from the UK and his medical care would have been covered by the NHS. Also, it's just a small complaint, but in the opening lines of Hulkster in Heaven, Hulk says, "I read it in the papers, I saw it on TV." This implies that not only did Hulk know about the child's death before the match, but it was noteworthy enough to make it on the news. You can chalk it up to shitty songwriting, but I'm still considering it a lie. As bad as this is, and it is pretty shameful and disgusting to make up a story about a kid with cancer, it gets even worse. Over the last 22 years, Hogan has embellished this bullshit story in ways that only a delusional narcissist could. When Hulk spoke with Muscle and Health last year to shill some stupid CBD oil product, he told an even more unbelievable version of the Hulkster in Heaven story.
I was in Wembley Stadium and I saw a lot of Make-A-Wish kids. I had a kid there that was in rough shape. The EMTs were with him and he was on the stretcher. And, you know, his body odor and stuff, it had a smell to it that I hadn't smelled at all. Not bad, but it was just a different type of smell. I told the doctors and the EMTs, you know, the kid's in kind of trouble here, you know, so let me say my goodbyes and give him a hug and kiss him. And I got a nice place for him out at ringside at Wembley Stadium. It's all roped off.
In Hulk's original telling of the story, the kid was supposed to be sitting ringside, but in this version, Hulk had a special area roped off for him.
So I went to wrestle, and I kept looking, and the kid wasn't there. I said, what happened to the family out there? And they said, oh, the kid passed away. When I found out the kid passed away, my manager, Jimmy Hart, the Mouth of the South, he used to be in a band too. So we stayed up all night, and we wrote 12 songs for the kid's family.
Now Hulk is saying that he and Jimmy Hart stayed up all night with the intention of writing 12 songs for the family, not that they just came naturally as part of the writing process after they wrote Hulkster in Heaven. As bad as this is, somehow, Hulk added a whole new set of lies to the story in the form of a strange connection with Simon Cowell. Quote, Jimmy knew somebody from Select Records, and they got a hold of Simon Cowell. He produced a little album for us, and it went #1 on Billboard for 8 weeks. We donated the money to the family. Then Simon came back to me and said we needed to do the song with a band called Green Jelly and something called I'm the Leader of the Gang, a Gary Glitter song. That did really well on Billboard too. When I returned to the States, I had a crazy idea. Since I was still wrestling, I might make music here too. So I grabbed Cyndi Lauper and Rick Derringer and a bunch of people, and we recut a ton of songs. Simon came over and helped produce the wrestling album. Then he came back and produced the second wrestling album, Pile Driver, and he never left. He stayed here and he became this monster producer. He's the nicest guy in the world. He plays a tough guy on TV, but he's a real sweetheart. We're still great friends to this day. End quote. There is so much wrong with what he said here that it's going to take a minute to untangle all of it. First, Simon Cowell did not produce Hulk Rules. He's not credited on the album, and Jimmy Hart directly contradicted Hulk's story in the aforementioned Noisy interview by saying that Simon Cowell called them up after hearing Hulk Rules and helped facilitate the collaboration with Green Jelly. That also could not have happened as stated because their cover of I'm the Leader of the Gang came out in 1993, 2 years before Hulk Rules. Maybe Simon Cowell did hook them up with Green Jelly, but it can't have happened in the way they're saying it did. And as far as I know, Simon Cowell has not spoken on the issue. Hogan's story about grabbing Cyndi Lauper and Rick Derringer and having Simon Cowell produce the wrestling album and Pile Driver is equally nonsensical. Simon Cowell did work with the WWF to produce WrestleMania, the album, but that came out in 1993. The wrestling album, which did feature Cyndi Lauper and was produced by Rick Derringer, came out in 1985. And Pile Driver, the wrestling album too, came out in 1987. So unless Hulk Hogan once again used his Time Wizard powers, There is simply no way that Simon Cowell produced Hulk Rules in 1995, then introduced Hogan to Green Jelly in 1993, before coming to the States to work on the 2 wrestling albums in 1985 and 1987 respectively, then circled back to 1993 to do the WrestleMania album. But perhaps Hogan is just that generous with his time manipulation abilities.
Time Wizard!
Also, while it's basically peanuts in comparison to the rest of the lies in this story, Hulk Rules was not #1 on the Billboard charts for 8 weeks. It may have reached as high as number 12 on the children's charts depending on who you ask, but it seems hard to verify. Then we have the body odor comments. Hogan stops just shy of saying he could smell death on the kid, but what other implication could there be to this new addition? And what is the point of adding it to this story? To let us know that Hogan is clairvoyant or that he has super senses? This make-believe story is supposed to be about the tragic death of a child, not Hogan being a fucking X-Man. It elevates this from being an incredibly narcissistic and pathetic story to a truly sickening and depraved one. The worst part about all of this is that I don't think it's that far from the truth. Hogan has worked with Make-A-Wish.
It was me, Michael Jackson, Mr. T, who saw the Make-A-Wish kids during the 80s and 90s.
So this creepy, self-aggrandizing, child-sniffing fable was very likely inspired by real experiences Hogan had. But rather than actually dedicating the song to a real child or children or working with Make-A-Wish to produce Hulk Rules for charity, he just made a story up afterwards to make himself look like a thoughtful and charitable guy instead of a self-obsessed ghoul. It's fucking disgusting. At the same time, the story of Hulkster in Heaven is the most quintessential Hulk Hogan lie, because it's lies within lies, and to get to the truth you have to peel back the various layers and sift through all the detritus to find the evidence that proves him wrong. That can take hours, which is how, despite being called out countless times over the years, Hogan is still able to get away with most of this bullshit. When he was shilling CBD oil last year, he went on numerous podcasts and spoke for hours. I'm sure he told many more tall tales that the vast majority of people would not be able to debunk without investing a considerable amount of time into it. And if you're not familiar with Hogan's reputation as a liar, why would you even bother? It does make you wonder why he does it, though. Hulk is a living legend. He's one of the greatest pro wrestlers of all time and one of the most recognizable pop cultural figures of the 20th century. He's accomplished more than most people could ever dream of, and he's had enough experiences to fill multiple lifetimes. Why does he feel the need to embellish stories that were already legendary by any standard? Why do they get more grandiose as time goes by? Why does he make up stories out of whole cloth? That question is the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Hulk's lies are frequently hilarious, either because they're so ridiculous that they defy logic, or because they're so clearly lies that you wonder why he even tried telling them in the first place. But some of them are also quite dark and disturbing for what they suggest about his character. There is something insidious about his need to insert himself into stories of other wrestlers or insinuate he has some connection to the dead. I get the feeling that Hogan is unhappy with the idea that there could be any notable event in wrestling history that doesn't bear the mark of the Hulkster. So now he's retconning himself into events he never took part in, and in many cases would have been physically impossible for him to take part in. I suppose some of it comes down to Hogan honestly misremembering things. As I said, he has enough memories for multiple people, so it's possible he just gets things mixed up sometimes. I'm sure I got some things wrong while making this video, and I spent a lot of time researching it. I'm not going off the top of my head in a live interview. Also, Hogan has suffered a bunch of head injuries, so I doubt his memory is 100% as good as it could be. It's understandable that he might get some facts wrong, or misremember the date something happened. Regardless, some of these lies are so egregious that they can't be justified as simple mistakes. The only explanation is deception. The question then becomes, is he doing it intentionally? You start to wonder if he knows what he's saying is bullshit, or if he's told himself the story so many times that he actually believes it to be true. Is he saying these things as Hulk Hogan the character, while Terry Bollea the man knows them to be false? Are they even separate entities anymore? Or has the line between them blurred to the point that the distinction can no longer be drawn? Ultimately, that's a question that only Bollea/Hogan has the answers to.
We've talked about Hulk Hogan several times. I need to make you understand this, that Hulk Hogan gave up his privacy the moment he walked out his front door, became a celebrity in anonymity. And so I don't like talking about Hulk Hogan's penis, but I've already tried to explain to you, I gave up my right as Hulk Hogan to have Hulk Hogan have any privacy. I don't know how much clearer I can make that to you.
As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you would like to support the channel, please consider becoming a channel member, leaving a super thanks, or visiting the Patreon. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you, Squirt, Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Bone CK, Gaius Nietzsche Patton, Scott Richmond, Random Candor, Fuzi Eunice, Dot Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar Has Jungle Fever, Firebrand, Quasi, Sneps, Alex, Dimmy Stinkpong, and Neem.
Online gambling is just regular gambling on speed. But what if you actually did speed and then went to online gambling in your family's home in front of over 1,000 people?
Everybody say hi, Mom. Oh my God, there it is! Yeah! Ah, dude!
Bossman Jack was born Austin Curtis Peterson in April 1995 to two loving parents. He grew up with one sibling in a good, stable environment. His parents seemed really wholesome, with his mom often posting about her love and support for her sons, which means a lot considering the things Austin gets up to. Austin's brother Andrew graduated from college, got married, has a job at an insurance company, and is in an alternative rock band. Lolcows often come from broken homes, but Andrew, being completely normal in every way, proves that there's no issue with their upbringing whatsoever. The brothers seem to be on good terms with each other nowadays, despite the hints that they were at one point at odds, with Austin recounting a physical fight between them at an undisclosed point in time.
My brother, I knocked him out cold.
But this hardly proves that they hated each other or anything serious like that. If anything, the fact that the two brothers fought once makes their relationship more normal rather than the opposite. Eventually, it seems they simply grew apart and lost touch, with Austin even admitting to having forgotten his brother's birthday.
Bro, he just turned 32. Now I think about it. September 22nd. Yeah, I totally missed his birthday. Now I think about it.
In his youth, Austin was a bit of a delinquent. He liked skateboarding, smoking weed, fishing, and being a criminal. In 2013, when Austin was 18, he was caught trying to buy alcohol while underage. But this is a very common charge, and were this the only one he got, it wouldn't really matter. However, 1 year later, Austin, accompanied by two friends, rampaged through the Brickshire area of New Kent, Virginia, rummaging through 12 vehicles and stealing anything they could find. The reported stolen items included loose change, credit cards, a high-end camera, jewelry, and even a firearm. Though I should say the person responsible responsible for taking the gun was one of Austin's accomplices. Following an investigation by the New Kent Sheriff's Office, the three of them were arrested in connection to the robberies. From what I can understand, he was charged with a total of 21 counts, including 3 different kinds of larceny and tampering with a vehicle. However, he got a deal in which he pled guilty to just 4 of those counts, all of them misdemeanors, and all the other charges would be dropped, with him getting a year of probation and a fine of a little over $3,000 as a means of restitution to the victims. Due to how poorly planned and executed this criminal act was from the get-go, Austin was probably going to get caught no matter what he did, but I should note the fact that he made it easy for the cops to connect him to it when he started looking up items he'd stolen on Google to see what they were worth, presumably so that he could ask for that value from the person he intended to pawn it to, who was also arrested and convicted, by the way. Ultimately, Austin only spent 29 days in prison, the judge's reasoning being that it was a sufficient wake-up call for Austin to not reoffend. It's unknown what exactly swayed the judge, but it's speculated there were many members of the community, including the deputy police chief of the county, testifying in favor of Austin's character. According to them, Austin had just fallen into the wrong crowd and was a normal kid caught up in drugs, alcohol, and immaturity. When viewers brought this up on stream, he showed a lot of remorse and admitted the reason for the crime was to feed his addiction to Xanax.
Karma bit me so hard in the ass, and I deserve every fucking bit of it, and I'm still not the same. I will never be the same again after I got fucking arrested for fucking stealing out of fucking cars, dude. Innocent people's fucking cars, bro.